Hi everyone, welcome. So as people are coming in, if as usual you'd like to change your name so that it also shows your UWC affiliation and also maybe where you are at the moment so we can kind of see the geographic spread of us all. That's always nice to see. So, hi, it's great to see so many of you back. I think we're on 113 and it's still climbing steadily for today's third and final of this special edition series within the UWC Unlocked Talks, titled Meeting at the Crossroads, a Dialogue on Race Relations. So as you probably know by now, this has been organized and led by three alums, Tamaisha AYLE, Dr. Rachel Thwaites-Williams, and JuanAntonio Nelson, who is on hand today as our moderator. Sarah and I will also be here as usual to answer any technical questions you might have. So yeah, if you have any problems at all, please just send those directly to us throughout the call. And I'm also here to quickly go over some tech/housekeeping points before we can get started. So the first point to note is that unlike the other Unlocked Talks, this is also going to be an hour and a half, but of course you can leave anytime you want to or need to. Please also keep yourselves on mute unless you're called upon by JuanAntonio, our moderator. And if you do have a question, you can just write that in the chat at any time, and JuanAntonio is going to make a speaker list. And yeah, we'll assume that you want to read out your question yourself, but if this is not the case or you don't have the internet for it, just indicate that in the chat. And then JuanAntonio will read it for you. As we are so many people, also keep in mind time when you are speaking, just so we can hear from as many voices as possible. And then, yeah, finally and most importantly, as with the first two sessions, we might be touching on some quite emotional issues. So if anything comes up and you want to leave at any point, that's absolutely fine, no explanation needed. And also, yeah, if you have an incident of racism or racial discrimination at UWC to report, you can do so through the safeguarding section of the uwc.org website. And Sarah is going to link that in the chat now for you. So with that said, let's move on to today's talk. Today we're going to be diving into the area of anti-racist education, and we have the pleasure of being led through the next hour and a half by JuanAntonio Nelson, who's our moderator today. JuanAntonio is from Jamaica, and he's a graduate from UWC South East Asia, where he left in 2017. You may also recognize his name more recently from the UWC Alumni Facebook group. And today he's joining us from Newfoundland, Canada, and he's a current student at Luther College in Iowa, USA, where he's pursuing a BA in visual communication. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, JuanAntonio.
Thank you so much, Celia. Welcome, everybody. I hope we can learn a lot today and have a productive discussion. Today we'll be talking about anti-racism and education. Specifically, the revolution is in the details. So we will first start out with Rebecca Warren, the head of education development at the UWC International office. And then she will then introduce Andrew, where we will learn more. So if you have any questions, again, you can just leave them in the chat and we will go through. It's a safe space, so let's be respectful and it will all be good. So Rebecca, I'll turn over to you now.
Thank you, JuanAntonio. So I'm not going to speak very long, but it is my great pleasure to actually introduce Andrew. Andrew and I have known each other for about 1.5 years and have been working together sort of on and off. Andrew's been helping sort of with the curriculum development work at UWC. So he first helped facilitate the Maastricht Hub, which happened in February last year, where we gathered about 50 people, staff, student, alumni. We locked them in a room for about 3 days and said, you can't come out until we've kind of figured out this education thing and what are we doing and why are we doing it. It was a fantastic facilitated time and we got a lot out of it, and that started really the process of a deep dive into education, its purpose, the big why, and what we wanted to actually achieve in terms of educational development moving forward at UWC. Andrew is an alum from the, first of all, the PSYL short course at Pearson. He then moved from that to UWC USA. He was a Davis Scholar at Dartmouth And then he did his master's at Harvard in the education department, and not content with that, he is now at NYU doing his postdoctoral thesis in education. So he is very, very qualified to speak on education. He has been a partner for youth empowerment facilitator, and has led youth camps in Uganda and elsewhere. And it's through that and through the lens of creative facilitation that he really comes to this work and comes alive. And I'm sure you'll see what I mean as he talks today. The last time I had a conversation with Andrew in person was when we were trapped in a car. We were supposed to be taking a short journey from Middlebury, where together he and I had hosted the IB, including the Director General, Dr. Sivakumari, Davis University admissions groups, and various members from UWC, and we were discussing the future of education and what was possible in order to take our educational development forward. So Andrew and I had facilitated that conversation. We were driving back to Boston. It was meant to be 3.5 hours. We got stuck in a February Vermont snowstorm, and actually our car journey ended up being 9 hours. And during that time, there was non-stop conversation about education, about UWC, and about anti-racism at UWC. And so it's in that light, and that when we say the conversation with Andrew, I've asked him to try and capture some of the reflections that that conversation brought up, his deep work engaged with UWC and beyond UWC in his doctoral thesis and all the research that he has done. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Andrew.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, JuanAntonio, and greetings to you all. I am calling in from New Haven, Connecticut, where I am based during this stay-at-home quarantine season, and it's a true joy to be here in conversation with you all. And I want to honor the work and the courage that you have, Rebecca, for leading with clarity and pushing and innovating in the work of education. It's been a real joy to be in conversation and partnership with you on this work. And I also want to give a shout out to the folks who hosted the last two UWC Unlocked series on race and education. I specifically wanted to name the speakers from yesterday's talk, Jordan, Yol, and Catherine, and lift them up and celebrate their vulnerability and their courage and their truth speaking. I also want to honor the work of those who have come before us. And without their efforts, without the efforts of people who have been pushing back on oppressive conditions of any kind, whether it's things related to labor, things related to racism, whether it's things related to gender, I want to honor those folks' effort, because without them, a moment like this would be difficult. We are relying on their resources, we are relying on their thinking, we are relying on their imagination, we are relying on their courage to be able to come together in community. And so I want to lift up the work that has come before us, a lot of which I'll be drawing on to offer my reflections. And I want to also celebrate a few big wins here in the US. The Supreme Court just just struck down the president's unlawful order to end a policy that protects undocumented folks in the country, the DACA policy. And a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court issued a decree that it was unlawful to terminate or discriminate in the workplace based on LGBTQIA+ status. And so those are two unexpected big wins that I am celebrating. And it's also an honor to be speaking and sharing with you all on the eve of June 10th, where tomorrow is a specific day in the US that commemorates the emancipation from slavery, and Texas was the last state to decree that that slavery is wrong and should end. And we are celebrating Juneteenth tomorrow. So it's an honor to be speaking and to share my thoughts in the confluence of everything that is going on. Before I get into the gist of the reflections I would like to share, I wanted us to take 30 seconds, 30 seconds just to tune in. We are living in a moment that that is tearing the curtain back on anti-Black violence. And I just wanted to name and honor how that violence does not allow Black bodies to grieve. Right after all this, right after the many incidents that we've seen on the media of police brutalizing Black bodies, Black folks have not been given the privilege, or we don't have the privilege of grieving, and it's not just grieving these videos that we've been seeing floating around, the photos that we've been seeing floating around. These are not moments. This is a legacy, and it is historic trauma. It is structural trauma, and I want to acknowledge how a lot of the anti-racism work that is happening right now is happening in a web of institutions that are framed on whiteness that do not allow Black bodies to grieve, that do not allow Black mothers to grieve. And so I just wanted to take these next 30 seconds just to honor the pain, to honor the suffering, to honor the reality that lives are asking to matter, and also to tune into your body and just to be present for our time together as a way of entering into this space with mindfulness. And so we'll just spend the next 30 minutes with that silence. Do whatever you need to do to bring yourself to a place where you are present and to attune to the level of suffering that is present and the lack of the privilege to grieve. Thank you. My when Rebecca sent me about 10, I don't know, I'm exaggerating, not 10 messages, but Rebecca bombarded me with different messages asking whether I would be willing to be in conversation, to show up today. And it's been a little crazy on my end. And when I see a message from Rebecca that's saying, "Can we talk?" I know that it's serious, and I drop everything and I show up. And so thank you for pushing on that, Rebecca. I thought for our time together, my intention is to share 3 big ideas. I think for folks who are joining this series, and this is the first series that you're attending, I'd recommend that you find the videos from the first 2 talks that provide a lot more context than I will be providing today. I think a question that I'm holding in my mind as we spend our time together today is, where do we go from here? And I am sharing reflections on 3 big ideas that UWC, if it's truly committed to taking anti-racism seriously, to dismantling racism, these are 3 ideas that I'm proposing UWC UWC consider. And so you'll hear me use that phrase a lot. I'm inviting you to consider. And these are not the only ideas that help move the organization forward, but I thought that these are three ideas that help us align whatever efforts we'll be taking as individual UWC schools, efforts that we'll be taking as a whole organization, as a whole movement, efforts that we can take individually. And as I mentioned, I'm drawing on the work of key thinkers, pushers, philosophers, the work of activists that has come before me, and I want to name and acknowledge that. And I hope that our time is generative, and there'll be some time at the very end to grapple with the three big ideas that I'm sharing. And as we move in, I would like to request that we do two things to support our learning during our time. The first is to embrace curiosity. And by that, I really would invite you especially to tune into what is going on in your physical body as you hear this conversation unfold, as you hear these reflections. A lot of the time, the education that we receive emphasizes a disembodied approach to working with knowledge, a disembodied approach to processing information. But I'm inviting you to tune into what's going on in your body and to remain curious. And when the going gets rough, turn to wonder. So those two things, embracing curiosity, and when the going gets tough, turn to wonder. If you are willing to do those things with me, I would like you to just show me a thumbs up. And for the folks who have their screens off, that's also okay. You can just do the thumbs up and I will trust that you're with me. Thank you very much. Super. So let's get right into it. I'm going to speak through three big ideas, and it's going to, I have my notes here, and we'll see where we go. I'm going to be drawing on history. I'm going to be drawing on personal experience. I'm going to be drawing on the context that has already been set in the last two talks, and then we'll open it up. If you've had a chance to look at the messages that have been coming from the UWC governance, you'll have noticed that the board sent out a letter, the executive director and the board sent out a letter that was highlighting UWC's commitment to dismantling racism. And that is where we are beginning. And I'm presenting these three big ideas as a way forward. And they're not the only ideas, but I think they are transformative. And I am reclaiming the word, we hear the word transformative thrown around a lot. We never even stop to question, what do you mean by transformative? And by transformative, I am putting a stake in the ground and saying reform is not enough, tweaking is not enough, radical transformation, the radical undoing of the structures of oppression, and a radical imagining of new structures that are based on liberation is what transformation means for me. And it's what undergirds the ideas that I'm presenting today. So the first big idea, UWC should reclaim its mission as moral vision and clarity that sustains. UWC should reclaim its mission as a moral vision and clarity that sustains. A lot of what we're seeing, both in the US and internationally, in the field of education, is very much based on it's market-based reform. The kind of changes in everyone talks, we need change in education, we need change in education. Everyone from different political orientation says we need change in education. And there are folks who are talking about the purpose of education, but a lot of the conversation around change in education is happening from from this place that that market-driven reform is going to solve our issues. And I'm going to trace some of the moral visions that have been put forward in history, and then kind of come back to this market-based vision of education that is claiming that the market is going to solve our problems, and trouble a little bit of that vision, and then suggest why the UWC mission provides the level, clarity, and force of moral clarity that we need in a time like this. When we think about education, when I think of education, I think in terms of I would call it maybe 4 epochs. One is the indigenous epoch, the nation state epoch that cannot be separated from the work of missionizing. I'll come back to that in a bit. I think of the corporate globalization market-driven epoch, and then I think of the planetary world view as an epoch. And I grew up in Uganda, and a lot of how I learned the history of the country was that when missionaries came to the country, they introduced education, and I went to, all my schooling was in schools that were religiously founded. So schools that were tied both to the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, and influence of the, and also with influences of the evangelical tradition as well. We learned in class that when the missionaries came and when they established the education systems that were our legacy as a country, they mentioned that the indigenous forms of education that were rooted in the lived experiences of communities, in the lived experiences of tribes, was quote unquote informal education, informal learning. And that the kind of education that was about sitting in the classroom and learning, learning about Canadian prairies and the French Alps and drawing maps of New York, that was formal education. And informal education was supposed to be a thing of the past. It was irrelevant. Formal education was it. And so even when I think about indigenous forms of education, my understanding of it begins with an erasure. The understanding of indigenous forms of education begins with erasure. In the US, the understanding of indigenous forms of education begins with genocide. I highlight that to show, and you're going to see some of the complexities as we go through, but if I were to hypothesize, if I were to think what were indigenous forms of education trying to do, that form of education it was very much about identity. What is your place in the tribe? What is your place in the world? What is your place in the tribe particularly? And how do we survive? It was a form of education that was linked to the day-to-day lived material experiences of folks. It was erased. In its place was a form of education that was rooted in the nation state and very much rooted in the work of missionizing. And so I think a lot about that intersection of religion and education. And especially when I think of it from the perspective of a Ugandan, from the perspective of somebody who has gone through those systems, I see the working of whiteness beginning right from there. So when we hear, from the first talk, the context on the history of whiteness was set. And the history of our education, the history of our religious systems is fundamentally anti-Black, is the point I'm trying to make here. it is saying that the indigenous ways of understanding the world are illegitimate. And so my reflection on these two epochs, the indigenous epoch and then the nation state, is that the indigenous epoch of education was limited in articulating a vision of identity that transcends the tribe. Enter the nation state and missionary work. And I am a legacy of that education myself. Having gone through the education system in Uganda, and achieved and got quote unquote opportunities to apply to the United World Colleges. I got on the plane. I arrived August 21st, 2010 here in the US in Atlanta airport. And I went to pick up my bags and I'd overpacked my one big suitcase. And that suitcase had actually, the zippers had broken. And in Uganda, there were issues of colorism, but we never discussed race at all. So I go to pick up this bag from the conveyor belt in Atlanta. I just entered the country and I see my bag on the conveyor belt. The zippers are broken, things are spilling out. And immediately I look around and I kind of see people carrying all these cute suitcases, and I tell myself, you know what, Andrew, you should go pick up your suitcase. They will not mind. You are Black. Go pick up your suitcase. They will not mind. You are Black. In my mind, I'd come to associate brokenness. I'd come to associate lackluster. I'd come to associate substandardness, non-classiness with Blackness. No one had ever taught me a lesson about race. But in that one instance, my whole socialization caught up with me and brought up race as an issue. And I asked myself, why? Why in that moment did I think? Why in that moment did I equate carrying a broken suitcase in a world of whiteness and saying they will not mind? You are Black. I get a pass because I am Black. Why? That was the first time I began to learn about race. I was never Black until I came to this country. And so a question comes up for me: if the form of education that is very much tied to the nation state, very much justified by missionary education, or the work of missionizing, if that form of education is really generative, why is it so that as a product of that education, I came to think of myself as lower than a white person? What happens when the metaphors that we use, the textbooks that we use, the fact that we were spanked for speaking our local language in my classroom? This is what we are not even talking, more than 20 years ago. This is, fellow Black teachers who are teaching us English, and they're using phrases like, I am not caning you. Caning is what we use for spanking. I am spanking this is the government's mitt. And they're using phrases like, you need to learn these things, otherwise the white man's plane will leave you. This is the language I grew up with. And I'm sharing these stories to kind of, to trouble this assumption that anti-Blackness is only something that we hold as an individual transgression, something that we hold, or something that is deeply personal. It is structural, and it begins with policies. When I think of the logics of the form of education that begins with dominance, a form of education that begins with empire, especially for folks who are familiar with the history of the African continent. The Scramble for Africa was a specific policy that was generated to steal resources from the African continent. And with that came a form of education that was justified by a form of religion that upheld whiteness. That is the epoch of the nation state. The limitation of logics of education that are framed around identity to a nation state, framed around identity of Blackness as being inferior to whiteness. And here I'm really calling out the justification of racism and racist policies using religious language. And here, the reason why I'm really invoking the work of religious missionizing is not because religion is wrong. That's not the argument I'm trying to make here. The argument I'm trying to make is that the spiritual language and religious language has been co-opted to justify racist policies from history, and that our education systems are not immune to that. Fast forward, I come to the US, and one of the things that happens when I attend UWC, we participate in this interfaith dialogues. Now, while I was in Uganda, having grown up, my mom passed away, and she had raised us Anglican, and my dad really never cared much about church, so I was a little ambivalent. When my mom passed on, my sisters they became very committed to evangelical tradition, and I became socialized in that tradition, grew up in it. And while I was in school in Uganda, we would begin schooling in the morning with prayers, and then class would happen. And would hear the Reverend saying things like, if you do not pass your exam, if you do not come to chapel, God is going to make you fail your exams. This was my socialization as an adolescent. And I began to tune into other different ways of thinking about religion, other different ways of thinking about my own faith. And I began to listen to preachers in the West who were talking about the message of grace, who were saying something different. They were saying something like, you do not need God. You do not need God you do not need to fast repent for God to love you. God loves you already. So it was this gospel of grace that kind of like opened up this little world around acceptance. And I began to push back a bit on what the Reverend was saying. And I felt, in many ways, I did not see it as a form of activism at all. I just saw that like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. Fast forward coming to the US, participating in these interfaith dialogues. And what surprised me the most about these dialogues is that I began to see the Reverend that I criticized in my own self. We were doing an activity where we had pipe cleaners. I was paired up with a friend from Palestine, and she was Muslim, and she created, we were asked to model our identities. And I modeled my identity, and in the middle of it, I put a cross, and she modeled her identity. In the middle of it, she put a green crescent. They asked us to exchange these models, and the facilitator said, now take out one strand. There were 3 strands that we were using, and the facilitator said, take out one strand from your friend's model. Of course, I took out the central piece from my friend's model, and we were supposed to debrief. And my friend told me during the debrief, when you took out that central piece from my model, it felt like you had ripped my life apart because you had taken my religion away from me. And for the first time, I recognized that the way that I was belonging to my faith was a form of violence. My faith in and of itself wasn't a form of violence, but the way I was belonging to it was a form of violence. And that incident is the one that got me kind of like thinking, and I began to read through, you know, I took an anthropology class. I began to read, you know, why all the Black kids sitting together, in the cafeteria, and just being exposed to the embeddedness of whiteness in my own socialization, where you know, going to church and singing things like "Wash me as white as snow," and so in my mind, whiteness becomes embedded. The pursuit of whiteness becomes embedded in my pursuit of this education opportunity and the way that I'm showing up in the world. And so the question I'm posing is that vision of education enough? Is that vision of education the best that we can do? The nation state and the history of missionizing education. The third epoch that I reflect on is the current epoch, the corporation, the market, and globalization. And here we see the transcendence in many ways. We see the transcendence of the nation state. So we begin with the tribe, we move to the nation state, we move now to the corporation. And what the corporation is promising is that let's leave everything up to competition. Let's see how there's some neutral ground. It's a false neutral ground. Let's leave everything up to competition. Things are going to fall in place with education. And I want to focus in a little bit on the logics of market-based education reform. And I want to propose that market-based reform does not offer the moral clarity and the moral vision that we need in a time like this. Market-based education reform is emphasizing a lot of, let's see, how does it show up? It's emphasizing, you know, accountability and testing. All right, so we have a whole investment in creating either standardized testing. We need to make, you know, and then strict protocols for what teachers are doing in the classroom in the name of quality education, quality teaching. Market-based education is about choice, and it's emphasizing the individual as a consumer. So competition, choice, individualism, and the individual as a consumer. And I'll add one more, that technology is the chief actor in all of this rather than the human being. And given that matrix, and given the matrix of control and conquest that is associated with competition, market-driven reforms in education are leaving the human in the place of a consumer. We are consuming modalities of education. So instead of turning our attention to what's going on in this web of oppression, of these intersecting systems of oppression, we are spending a lot of time debating whether we should do place-based education, whether we should do experiential learning, whether we should do, you know, we are spending a lot of time looking at modalities. I am not saying that that is wrong. I'm just saying that there's a lack of a moral clarity and a vision. There's lack of a bigger why, and without that moral clarity, we cannot dismantle the structures of oppression. And for folks who as I go through these three big ideas, you might find yourself asking, well, what are you saying? Where are you talking? If there is a place where you are feeling lost, there is going to be a resource. There's a resource document where there's a number of different resources if you want to become familiar with some of these legacies, some of this history, some of these ideas. But I want to propose that market-based reforms in education provide a false neutrality. And I think in many ways, UWC comes in right around when this idea of globalization and the corporations are beginning to consolidate a lot of power to work. Power to work across states, power to accumulate capital, and and UWC comes in to articulate this new vision. But I think the fact that after 60 years, we are still able to hear testimonials like we had yesterday, that racist acts are still happening. The fact that we have testimonials like the one that my brother has written. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the I'm Afraid No More that my brother Zito Mbowa has written. So it's a lengthy testimonial about racism at RCN, and it's not just RCN. It's everywhere, like we had yesterday. The fact that it's been 60 years of UWC, and only now do Black voices feel that there is a crack to speak up, not even a platform, just a crack to speak up, suggests to me that there is a problem, and there is, right? And I think I asked myself, like, where is that problem? Where is that problem? And UWC creates this quote unquote neutral ground that all folks from these different nations and cultures can come together. And I am suggesting that our mission is not neutral ground. Our mission provides a moral clarity for a different kind of ground, which I'm going to speak about with the last epoch, the planetary worldview. But the danger of neutrality cannot be separated from the tyranny of erasure. When we do not specifically look at the history and the legacy of our visions, the history and legacy of our practices, the vision and legacy of our organizations of education, we are easily tricked to believe that just because we are bringing different people together in the same place, we are free from the work of anti-racism. And that is not true. We are a legacy, our institutions are a legacy of racism. They are built on anti-Black violence and terror. And if that is, if that is a question for folks, I mean, you take a look at the policies, the trade policies that happened in the past, and begin with slavery, and even before that, how missionary and explorer work was used to create and amplify tensions among tribes in order to conquer, in order to steal resources. When you look at that history, you begin to see a system that is built on anti-Blackness, a system of belief, a system of policy, a whole structure that is justified that the Black person is the savage. The Black person is the one who should be civilized. The work of education and the work of civilization has a racist legacy, is the point I'm trying to make here. And so I'm also arguing that the vision that is presented in the market is falsely neutral, but it's emphasizing competition, control, and conquest. And we hear phrases such as, we need to prepare younger generations to compete in the marketplace. We need to get young people ready for the marketplace. And now we're hearing that the reality of the world is that it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. What does it mean to train young people for an uncertain, for a future we don't yet know, for a future we don't even know whether we'll survive or not? In this kind of complexity, I am arguing that our efforts that are very much rooted at this level of trying to figure out which curriculum do we use, which approach do we use, is this place-based education? I am saying that that is not enough if we are not clear about why, and that is not going to sustain the work of dismantling racism. The question I'm asking is that, is there a vision of education that is life affirming rather than profit affirming. And so the last part of this first big idea, the proposal I'm making that UWC has a vision that provides moral clarity for the times that we are living in, is rooted in this, what I'm calling this kind of epoch that we need to move towards, which is a planetary worldview. The fact that we are all citizens of this universe, and if I zoom out, possibly a multiverse. In that world, there is no center. In that world, forms of dominance, forms of hierarchy become queered and disrupted, right? And I ask myself, can a planetary worldview allow us to claim the vision, the mission of UWC as a moral strength and moral clarity that allows us to reframe how we talk about UWC, that allows us to reframe how we fund UWC, that allows us to reframe how we deliver our education programs in UWC, that allows us to reframe what we do as a movement. Our house is on fire, and market-based education reform is not going to cut it. The UWC mission provides us with that moral clarity. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that part is that a lot of the conversation in my work with UWC, a lot of the conversation where I've seen things break down is the fear on behalf of our leadership, the fear on behalf of our leadership to truly root into what our vision promises. Out of what, will we lose funding as a result? Will will our kids be accepted to colleges as a result? Those are genuine concerns for any leadership, hands down. What I haven't heard is an invocation of the moral clarity. At one point, there was some kind of moral clarity that was ardent that the resources on the African continent needed to be exploited. Policies were created, religions were created to ensure that that policy was delivered on. I am arguing that our world as is not a given, and that if we claim the real promise of the mission that we have, it gives us the moral clarity to act, the moral clarity to push back, the moral clarity and the reason why we should be doing things differently, because this work is not easy and it's not desirable to kind of put yourself in danger all the time. No one wants to be living in a world where they live, where they are in fear of their lives just because they're speaking out. And the only reason why we do it is because of the moral clarity that something is not right, something needs to shift. And so I'm asking the UWC movement, what will it take to reclaim the mission as a moral resource in the work of dismantling racism? The second big idea is that we should reframe access to a UWC education from an opportunity to reparations. The language of access, the language of opportunity, which I have used myself, for a long time, right? Feeling very grateful for getting a scholarship to come to UWC, feeling very grateful for getting a scholarship to go to Dartmouth. It is well-intentioned. That framing is well-intentioned. And I'm suggesting that it is also erasing the history of plunder that has come before. It is not questioning why is it that opportunity is needed in the first place. I do not know how many people have experienced this, but I know that I think it's important. I think it's important to express gratitude, and I'm very grateful for people who take their resources and are able to offer scholarships. I wouldn't be where I am without the scholarships. But I want to name a lot of what we've seen over the last 3 days has been a breaking of the silence. And folks have been talking about experiences of racism they've had at UWC. And I want to name a silence around this very small, well-intentioned moment of writing a thank you letter to a donor. I'd felt it, but I hadn't articulated it until I had to both write a letter and then sit in a meeting at Dartmouth for people who had donated money. And I felt the pressure to kind of express my deep gratitude. And something about it felt very dehumanizing, actually. Something about it felt like, wow, you know, why do I feel so small? Why do I feel so small? And this idea that access to opportunity, that people who are speaking out about racism should be grateful for the opportunity that they've been given, I am suggesting that that is a form of psychic violence. That the way we have structured our form of education that is very paternalistic in nature, that demands us to silence our suffering in order to keep the system as is, in order to placate, in order to kind of like, shush, do not raise noise. That system is a form of psychic violence. It's a form of psychic violence when you consider the mission of UWC. And I'm suggesting that we rethink what it means to access a UWC education by reframing the UWC education as a form of reparations. That would mean that we ask ourselves, what would be the indicators that we are meeting? What would be indicators that we are meeting this new reframing of access to a UWC education as reparations rather than opportunity? Do Black folks have psychic resources for self and collective regeneration? Do they have physical resources for meeting their basic needs for survival and resources for individual and collective self-determination? Do Black folk have cultural resources for safety, connection, and belonging? Do Black folk have structural resources for self-governance and building the civic life that makes their lives matter? To the extent that Black folks do not have those resources, we are not meeting the mandate of reparations, and we are demanding that Black folks silence their voices in order to placate the paternalistic structure that we have set up. That is a form of psychic violence, and that is extending, it's reproducing the real forms of psychic violence that are the legacy of imperialism, colonialism, and the work of missionizing that robs Black folks of their indigenous capacity to create, to self-govern, to self-determine. If we are able to imagine a politics and a policy and narratives to justify them as deep and inbuilt as slavery and anti-Blackness, I believe that we are able to imagine a policy and a politics that allows us to reframe access to UWC education as a form of reparations. And some folks might be asking, what about white people? What about other folks? I am suggesting that the current system that we have is built on a hierarchy with whiteness at the top and Blackness at the bottom. To the extent that Black women, Black queer folk, Black young queer folks do not have access to psychic resources, physical resources, cultural resources, structural resources for their safety, their well-being, and their individual and collective self-determination, we are not meeting the mandate of a UWC. The third big idea, which is the final one, is a commitment to abolitionist teaching as a design principle for the education program at UWC. And here I'm building on the work of people who have put their bodies on the line. And for folks who are interested, Bettina Love has a great book that is on our resource page that was shared in the chat. and it's about abolitionist teaching. And if we are to take the argument that the UWC mission provides us with a moral clarity and vision for education in the 21st century, if that is true, if it's true that when we examine the legacy of education, and especially when you trace the journey that Black African students take to come to UWC, when you examine the experience of race and racism in the US particularly, and in the many, and beyond the US also, you begin to see that this is a system that is not working to make Black lives matter. And the only way of achieving an education that allows Black lives to matter is through abolitionist teaching. That is the fundamental crux of what Bettina Love and many other folks she draws on, and now myself, say when we talk about abolitionist teaching. And here I'm thinking in two ways. I'm thinking structurally and relationally. There is a form of education that we can do, and I think UWC is doing it, a form of education that allows us to survive in the current structure, social, political, economic structures, where it's, you get this education, great. You go to college, great. You get a good job, great. I am suggesting that conformity, survival, is not equal to liberation and freedom. And that structurally we need to ask, how do funding and organizational policies replicate these intersecting structures of oppression that are fundamentally anti-Black? What is it that we have created that makes the voices that we are now beginning to hear from uncomfortable, silenced, and just relegated to internal suffering? And I'm suggesting we need to rethink our structures, we need to rethink our policies, we need to rethink the place of funding in this work. And relationally, we need to think about what kind of pedagogical strategies are we using? What kind of curricula are we using? Who is being represented in the classroom, and how are they being represented? What is the composition of this deliberate diversity that we have? And if a Black person entered this ecology, would they feel like they matter? And here, some indicators, or a key question that we should be asking ourselves, every one of us, is how are we advancing whiteness and anti-Blackness in the way we raise money for UWC, in the way we structure and organize education programs for students, in the way we recruit students, in the way we relate to the host communities in which our UWCs are located, and in the way that we send off young people. To the extent that we are not asking those questions, we are replicating the legacy of racism. Again, anti-racism is about the details. What can we do to alter it? If we have been sophisticated enough to come up with ways of testing what young people have learned, if we have been sophisticated enough to create measures, reliable measures that are capturing, your level of IB performance, if we've been able to create a sophisticated system of getting students to these schools, I am suggesting that we are sophisticated enough to create ways of holding our institutions accountable as we try to deliver on the promise of dismantling racism. And some ideas that I'm thinking of here is, especially in terms of how we do education, I would love if the biology teacher committed to inspiring a sense of wonder about microbes, and connecting that sense of wonder to a critique of structures of oppression, belonging with the despair of beginning to wake up to see the interlocking structures of that oppression, and to equipping young people with the capacity to imagine what an alternative might look like. I would want the biology teacher to do it as much and as well as the English teacher does it, as much and as well as the history teacher does it. if that is to happen, we would need to reimagine how we teach. And I am suggesting that beginning and supporting and nurturing communities of practice, moving to team teaching, where we hold each other accountable in the work of dismantling racism, and teachers set developmental intentions for themselves, for their students and as individuals, for their students as relational beings, and for the world, of saying, how will my way of teaching the lab today contribute towards anti-Blackness? We can hold ourselves accountable in communities of practice. I'm asking us to imagine how we use time and how we employ co-design and mentorship in asking us to move towards an anti-racist world. And that is not, and I think that point is saying that I'm not asking folks to feel ashamed or guilty. I'm saying that this work is a struggle. This work is dangerous. This work is key for our survival. And the only way to advance it, because we are so enmeshed in this system, is through communities that sustain our courage. What might communities that sustain our work of education as an anti-racist project look like, is a question I'm trying to pose. Just because you can teach the IB does not mean you can deliver on the UWC mission. And in closing, I would invite you to consider this. A lot of these conversations happen because of what we were seeing in the US. On May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by the police in Minneapolis. His last words, "Please, I can't breathe. My stomach hurts. Everything hurts. They're going to kill me, Mama." In the same week, on May 30th, Elon Musk launches the SpaceX Dragon capsule Demo 2. His words after the launch: "America is still the land of opportunity more than any other place for sure. There is definitely no other country where I could have done this, immigrant or not." Consider this. American taxpayers spend $107.575 billion more on police than public housing. They spend 7 times more on policing than on schools. We have the capacity to create an anti-racist world. What is lacking is a moral clarity and a moral vision and the will to do it. If we are going to create an anti-racist UWC, we're going to have to divest from the logics of empire and domination, and we're going to have to return the mission to its rightful place, that education is about liberation. And in closing, I would like to read these lyrics from a song that honors Ella Baker, who was an abolitionist. And she organized coalitions with civil rights movement, women's groups, anti-racist groups, anti-apartheid groups. Hers was a vision, was an activism that was rooted in a planetary worldview. The refrain or the chorus goes, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And let me just read for you the words of the verses. "Until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. And that which touches me most is that I had the chance to work with people, passing on to others that which was passed on to me." And this next quote captures for me the essence of UWC. "To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can shed some light as they carry us through the gale, the older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hand of the young who dare to run against the storm. Not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me, I need to be just one in the number as we stand against tyranny. Struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way my struggle survives. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice and I must be heard. At times, I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. If UWC is true to its mission, I'm asking that we reclaim that mission and organize our education for liberation. Our future depends on it. Our house is on fire, and the eyes of the future, as Terry Tempest Williams wrote, the eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they're asking us to look beyond our own time. Our mission gives us the moral clarity to act. The only education that is worthwhile in the face of fascism, in the face of tyranny, in the face of anti-Black violence, is an education that liberates. Thank you.
Wow, I want to thank Andrew for delivering such a powerful, deep discussion to us. I just want everybody to take just 30 seconds to roll your head around, just process what is in your body, like how are you feeling, just stretch out anything, and then we'll get right into questions. But just take 30 seconds to have a stretch. Okay, so right now we're going to invite Gadi from Pearson College to unmute their mic and just ask a question to Andrew. Gadi from Pearson College.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Look, I completely deplore racism, and I appreciate your words. Right, it's been super interesting to follow, and I'm a very strong supporter of the case for change. I think that we need to be super pragmatic about it, and we need to tie economic incentive to it. Otherwise, it's just talk. And to be super pragmatic about it and to tie economic incentive to it, the key is to focus on reforming the educational systems in the worst performing African American neighborhoods. I'm talking from a US perspective here, and I'm happy to hear about other countries. In the US, we really literally rob a lot of poor African American kids of their opportunity, because the quality of education that we provide to them in the public system is just horrendous, right? And that, in my mind, needs to be fixed. And the focus there needs to be on skills, skills, and skills. The skills that it takes to succeed in the 21st century. And I'm wondering, Andrew, if you see this differently.
Gadi, thank you for sharing that that reflection. I fundamentally disagree with I fundamentally disagree with your recommendation that what needs to happen is a focus on skills. You're asking Black people to try to survive in a world built for white people. Skills are not going to cut it when you make it with a degree, an Ivy League degree, only to find that even owning a home in America has a history. It's a lot more difficult for a Black person. Look at the middle class in America, and the Black middle class in America, the Black middle class, the white middle class America. That is like eons. We are talking about white America, when you just look at the middle class, has a legacy of a wealth that allows you to get a house, put a roof over your head, own a home, build wealth, and skills are not going to cut it when there is a legacy of plunder, where there is a legacy of really unpaid labor. unpaid labor. Skills are not going to cut it in a racist society. What I'm trying to say is that I agree with you. Pragmatism means that we need to change our policies. I'm working on a policy team right now that is supporting, that is trying to inform and support the platform, that the Democrats are going to run on. The idea of skilling Black people is the same as the idea of missionizing Black bodies to civilize them in Europe. So I fundamentally disagree. And I agree that it's important to have skills, but skills for what? Skills to survive, skills to resist, skills to create.
Andrew, the facts are not on your side. We have a history of super poor immigration to this country. For example, if you look at the immigrants from Vietnam that came here on boats with zero wealth, and a generation or two later, they're very successful in the American society. And the key difference is that they've been focusing on skills, on education.
Buddy, I'm actually going to request that I don't buy it. That's what I'm trying to say.
But that's the fact. You cannot argue with that.
Well,
African Americans have not been successful relative to poor Asian immigrants, because poor Asian immigrants, even though they came with zero wealth, focused on skills and education. And until we fix the educational system within underperforming Black communities, there's going to be no change. There's going to be just talk. And we can talk in the face.
Gadi, I thank you for your contribution, Gadi. And I would like also to give other voices a chance to step into this conversation. I will respond finally by saying that show me a policy that has worked based on education reform over the last years. Give me a policy, give me reform efforts that have worked, and I'll shut up.
All right, so thank you for that question, Gadi. If you have further questions, feel free to message Andrew after the chat, but does anyone else have any questions to ask Andrew? He divulged in a lot of information and we might be unclear about anything, so guys, feel free to just send a message in the chat and I can just call on you to speak up. Marissa, do you have a question for Andrew? You can unmute your mic and ask him.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Andrew. We actually went to the same UWC and I was a year before you, so it's really nice to see you and hear you speak. I think you bring up really important points. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned this a few times and you kind of play with the idea, but I'm wondering kind of specifically, UWC as an organization and as an educational institution seems quite vulnerable to the market forces. No, you talk a lot about that. And it seems to me, and I'm kind of biased because I'm a Marxist and a communist, so I always think about that from a kind of a class lens. And so it seems to me that it's very difficult for UWC to exist in this global capitalist superstructure and at the same time have moral clarity about and a structurally anti-racist pedagogy. Do you think those two can really coexist, and how do you envision that?
I just saw in the chat that Catherine Day wants to say something about market forces.
And what I wanted to say was this, is that we assume that the UWCs are supported by people who are just looking for an elite education, and they're just looking for that ticket into the Ivy Leagues and so forth. But we know that when you look at the media, and when you look at the crises in the world today, that there's also any number of people who would kill to have their kids in a system which is more idealistic and more dedicated to change. And so by taking this cynical view of what parents and national committees are looking for, we're actually denying those kids the chance of a real education, of the kind of education that we are claiming that we're offering. We're not willing to take that risk. And I think that there's been a tremendous shift in private views over the past few years, and that if we're not willing to mine that and to go with those people and to satisfy that so-called market of people who actually want to survive and to have kids who are pushing for the human race to survive, we're not even giving the future a chance.
Yeah, and my response to that, you know, is I'm not trying to say that economics is bad. I'm not trying to say that the market is bad. I'm just trying to say that it doesn't articulate the moral vision for why we should do education differently. You know, when you're talking about the implicit values in market-driven education reforms are about competition over cooperation. They're about accumulating capital, you know, for a few. They're about the advancement of the individual over the collective. And something to think about very practically about UWC, for example, many families, you know, my own family included, you know, when I was living Uganda, they were like, okay, you know, my being in the US, my being, you know, at UWC to them was a gateway. My success is their success, right? And so they see, and so you can imagine how much pressure, you can imagine how much, how loaded, how loaded my experience of UWC was before I ever stepped on a UWC, for example. This is not, I'm not saying that my experience is the only experience there is. I'm just kind of giving you a perspective that, that market-driven reforms to education and their emphasis on the individual as the actor, the emphasis on, you know, high-stakes testing and accountability, they do not offer the kind of moral vision that supports survival on this planet. If they had, we wouldn't be, I think we wouldn't be facing the current ecological crisis that we are facing.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We see that Leah and Marcella from Maastricht, you're raising your hand. Could you unmute your mic and ask your question, please?
Hello, yeah, so I'm Marcella from El Salvador, and I just graduated high school, like May. So what I want to say, like, according to the skills, and like, should we focus on skills or should we focus on reforming the systems of education, medical, whatever? I would say we definitely need systems more than anything, because I also grew up in El Salvador. It's a poor country, small poor country, we call it. But I know that there's good things going on there. Like, my mom's a doctor, and we don't lack the skill. We lack the opportunities or the equipment to do the stuff that other people are doing. And of course, there's problems like corruption, things like these, violence. But in terms of, do we need better doctors that come here teach us stuff? We do, but we don't only need doctors. We need the equipment to improve chirurgical procedures in the hospitals that there's only in private hospitals, that of course the poorest people who live in the rural areas can't afford. And there's always the public hospitals falling down, maybe literally or figuratively speaking, both. They're falling down because they don't get enough investment, because there's corruption and everything. But again, to emphasize on the point that what we need more in a globalized world as we live now, and we need more reformation of public structures, and like, yeah, just stop investing in police and start investing in education and everything else that we also need.
And thank you, Marcella, for sharing those reflections and for sharing the perspective from your place, from your country. And I wanted to highlight that the distinction between whether we should focus on skills or focus on, you know, system reform or focus on system transformation, it's it's a lazy question. It's a lazy distinction, and it's not true, right? That we should be thinking of those as separate activities. The work of abolition, which I'm talking about here, requires each and every one of us to begin where we are and to consider our sphere of influence. What can we do? If I find myself as a student, or if I find myself as a teacher, if I find myself as an administrator at UWC, if I find myself as the executive, if I find myself as a board chair, what am I committing to do to undo the legacy of anti-Blackness is what I'm asking. So it's in other words, I'm saying we need all hands on deck.
Yeah, if I might say, like, I definitely agree with that. And in school especially, like, we went through a like hard period of transition, and if you know, we had a protest at the beginning of the year because things were going a bit off, and it's again bringing on the question, like, I'm not like, yeah, you make, like, you do a job and you commit to your job, and we all do it equally, so students and staff work together. So like, it just feels like the moment you start thinking more about IB, because we teach it and we study it, and it teaches us things, and it's super important that we do it. But also when you start focusing more on that than on the experience, or start favoring others before those, like, we're one of the only schools that teaches film, so many people come to learn film and things like this. Like, it's super important to like keep in mind the core of what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you very much. We have one more question by Jens Walterman. So if you could unmute your mic and ask, please.
Well, I guess this was more intended as a comment on the side than a big question. But speaking from a leader's perspective, my question is about incremental change, Andrew. I thought your talk was really inspiring, and it resonates with me to think about reconnecting with a radical mission of liberalization. But to bet the whole farm is highly problematic when so many young lives depend on it. So I wonder what you can share in terms of reflections about incremental change in the face of the current situation, rather than sort of betting the farm and only thinking about the most radical change.
Yeah, thanks, Jens, and it's good to see you. The reason I'm struggling with the question is that if the question is about incremental change and gutting the farm, then I think in many ways, I think the reflections that I've shared, I don't know, I think they are put on this side. I see that as a false dichotomy too, actually. The work of anti-racism begins with the premise that we are all implicated in it. White, Black, otherwise, immigrant or not, right? And if we are going to talk about gutting the farm, then let's set our planet on fire before climate change does it, right? And I'm suggesting that that the incremental change, asking the question of incremental change versus radical transformation without asking the other question, who is incremental change serving? Who is incremental change continuing to serve is to not engage with the premise of anti-racism. And I think I would rather keep the conversation on who are we serving when we do what we do, and because this idea that there's incremental change, but we need to say incremental change to what? So I feel I struggle with the question because it doesn't excite me, because I don't think about it that way, right? I think, to me, I'm thinking in each of our positions, what are we committing to do? Some of it will be incremental, some of it is going to be radical, but I'm asking, is the commitment there? And are there accountability systems that we have in place to learn how far we've come and how far we have to go, right? Like what would it look like for UWC to create a report, an anti-racism report, where that includes some of the big oops, that UWC, the big blind spots, and articulate indicators of how far we have to do, and articulate these are the commitments we are making over the next year to disrupt this blind spot. I mean, to me, it might seem like incremental change, but that is radical as an idea, like just spitting off of my head. And so I do not know whether the question of incremental change versus radical gutting the farm is generative for the purposes of undoing racism if we don't ask who is the system serving.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jens.
So thank you very much for your question, Jen. Andrew, for replying so well. I think I'll just give Andrew the opportunity to give a final message to anybody, to everybody once more. Like if you have anything to say, but no pressure.
I think the only last reflection that I have, I think building on Jens' question, is that we cannot create without confronting history. Every time we've tried to do that in society, we have ended up either creating something that is irrelevant, something that mutates, or something that just does not dismantle oppression in the ways that are articulated in our UWC mission. And so the work happens on so many levels. The work happens within. The work begins with Andrew looking at the question, why do I think of myself as less when I'm trying to pick up my suitcase that is broken and in a land of whiteness, and beginning to deal with my own intra-psychic internalized oppression. Why do I prefer whiteness over blackness? The work is relational in the way that in the way that I belong with my friends, in the way that I teach my students. How the question is, how is anti-blackness showing up, and what can I do to disrupt it? The work is organizational. The work is in terms of the policies that we create, right? So a policy might look like incremental change, but it has significant ripple effects. If we are thinking systems, we know that every small thing that we do is going to ripple out. The work is systemic and structural as well. So the work should be happening on all these different levels, and we are all victims and perpetrators of racism is what I'm trying to say, and that we should make efforts to disrupt it. So thank you so much, everyone, for journeying with me and hearing these reflections. And I, I hope we have been challenged. I hope, and I have been challenged as well in articulating and naming this. But yeah, I hope we can consider what the history and legacy of our education systems are as we try to recreate the world. And I wish you all light and blessings.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And we just want to say thank you to the International Office for setting up the 3-day series. We have learned a lot in terms of how we can move forward. And I hope everyone can do their part to fight against anti-racism, anti-blackness racism. And before we go, if Sarah or Celia would like to just reiterate where people can find resources, or let people know where they can find the recordings of the previous meetings as well as this one, you can let everyone know.
Sure. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Andrew, Rebecca, and JuanAntonio. Again, incredible end to a really important 3-part series. All the recordings, for those who have asked, they will be on the UWC Hub in about a week, perhaps a little bit more. There have been a lot of resources shared throughout these 3 days. We will compile them and send those out as well. in an email to everyone who is in attendance. Again, that will take a little while, but there's also a working doc that you're encouraged to add your own thoughts. Many people from the talks brought their own resources to the discourse, which was great. So please do add them to the document. I don't know if we can link it again here, but Celia's on it. But we will also share that in the email so you can follow up with it. As discussed, this is just a beginning of a discussion that is going to be long going. So we're really happy that you were all here. If you have any questions, just let Celia or I know. You can contact us at the IO at any time. So, and of course on the UWC Hub or on the Facebook page, if it comes to that. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening, or whatever time of day it is where you are.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
Bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Very inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Ayo.
Great.
Very inspiring.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.